These are the technical specifications of Iran's Qaher 313 stealth fighter that exposed one of the most embarrassing military hoaxes in modern history. On February 1, 2013, Iranian President Ahmadinejad proudly unveiled what his government claimed was their indigenous fifth-generation stealth fighter jet, superior to both the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Within hours, military aviation experts worldwide were calling it a laughable hoax made of fiberglass and plastic parts. The story of the Qaher 313 begins with Iran's desperate need to project military strength. The Islamic Republic's Air Force was stuck flying 40-year-old American jets sold to the Shah before the 1979 revolution. F-14 Tomcats, F-4 Phantoms, and F-5 Tigers formed the backbone of their fleet, aircraft so outdated that even the United States had retired most of them decades earlier. Facing aging hardware and international sanctions that blocked access to modern fighters, Iran's leadership decided to announce they had leapfrogged directly to stealth technology. The unveiling ceremony during the 10-day Dawn celebrations, marking the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, was choreographed for maximum propaganda impact. President Ahmadinejad stood beside the sleek, angular aircraft designated F-313, while Defense Minister Ahmad Vahidi proclaimed Iran's entry into the exclusive club of stealth fighter nations. The aircraft's name, Qaher, means conqueror or tamer in Persian, and the number 313 holds special significance in Shia Islam, referring to the number of companions who will join the 12th Imam upon his return. Iranian officials made bold claims about their new fighter's capabilities. They insisted the Qaher 313 could fly at low altitudes, take off from short runways, carry two 2,000-pound bombs or 6 air-to-air missiles, and possessed advanced stealth characteristics that made it virtually invisible to enemy radar. The project manager, Hassan Parvaneh, claimed the aircraft was designed entirely by Iranian engineers using CAD software and fluent CFD analysis tools. But military aviation journalist David Senciati immediately spotted problems. The aircraft had implausible aerodynamics and a Hollywood sheen, he noted. It was far too small to be a functional fighter jet, and the cockpit looked suspiciously simple, similar to those equipping small private planes. Israeli aeronautics expert Tal Inbar was even more blunt in his assessment to Maariv newspaper. "It's not a plane, because that's not how a real plane looks." The evidence against the Qaher 313 being a genuine aircraft mounted quickly. Flight Global reported that unnamed Israeli experts dismissed the indigenous fighter jet as nothing more than a very sleek plastic model. Retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula called it laughable, while BBC Persian service journalist Cyrus Amini observed that it looks like a cheap copy of the American F-22. The most damning evidence came from careful technical analysis of the photographs released by Iran. The tire pressure markings visible on the aircraft's landing gear told a devastating story. During the F-313's first reported taxi test, analysts noted that the tire pressure indicator showed approximately 50 psi. To understand why this matters, consider that an F-4 Phantom requires tire pressures of 265 psi, while an F-15 needs 305 psi. If the Qaher 313 could safely roll on tires inflated to just 50 psi, it meant the aircraft weighed no more than 1/5 of what an F-4 does per unit of volume. In other words, it was essentially hollow. The cockpit revealed even more problems. Photographs showed a pilot squeezed into the cramped space with his knees jammed up above the cockpit's side borders and his helmet extending well beyond the ejection seat's headpad. A normal-sized pilot simply couldn't fit properly in the tiny cockpit. The instrument panel featured civilian avionics from Dynon and Garmin, companies that manufacture equipment for the home-built aircraft market, not military fighters. The backup airspeed indicator showed markings suggesting a stall speed of merely 70 knots and a never-exceed speed of about 260 knots, values more appropriate for a small turboprop aircraft than a supersonic fighter. Some observers noted the airspeed indicator was limited to just 300 miles per hour, far below what any jet fighter would require. The aircraft's aerodynamic design violated basic principles of flight. The air intakes positioned above the wings were far too small to supply adequate airflow to a modern jet engine. At high angles of attack, the engine would receive either turbulent air or no air at all, making sustained flight impossible. The placement meant that during aggressive maneuvering, the aircraft would essentially choke its own engine. Alfred Wong, a pattern maker who later created scale models of the Qaher 313, made perhaps the most embarrassing discovery about the aircraft's design. While examining photographs of the prototype, Wong suspected the wings looked familiar. When I was examining the photos of the prototype mock-up, I guessed that they actually cut up an old MiG-17's wings for it, Wang explained. The wings have a very distinctive plan shape, so for the pattern I bought a 1:72 scale MiG-17 and cut up the wings in the same manner, and it was indeed a perfect match. The revelation that Iran had literally used 1950s Soviet wing designs on their supposedly advanced stealth fighter was devastating. There would be no way that a clearly 50s vintage wing shape would work on a modern design, Wang concluded. The problems extended throughout the aircraft's structure. The canopy appeared to be made of opaque plexiglass rather than the sophisticated transparent materials used on real fighters. The landing gear looked non-retractable, and the gear bays seemed too small to accommodate stowed landing gear. The engine exhaust lacked the necessary nozzles for afterburners and had no apparent heat shielding to prevent the aircraft's structure from melting under high temperatures. Most tellingly, there was simply no physical space for the weapons Iran claimed the aircraft could carry. The airframe lacked internal weapons bays necessary for stealth operations, and there wasn't sufficient room under the wings for the external bombs and missiles Iranian officials described. The nose was too small to house any meaningful radar system, a critical flaw for a fighter aircraft that needs to detect and engage targets. When Iran eventually released video footage purporting to show the Qaher 313 in flight, the deception became even more obvious. According to Haaretz, the blurry video published by the Iranians purporting to show the Qaher 313 in flight seems to show not a manned fighter jet, but a small radio-operated drone. Photographs depicting the aircraft flying over snow-capped mountains were clearly digital forgeries. Faced with mounting criticism, Iranian officials attempted damage control. Defense Minister Ahmad Vahidi insisted that foreign media claims about the project were inaccurate and that the engine had been successfully tested, though he admitted the aircraft had not yet flown. Officials claimed the displayed aircraft was merely representative of the actual product in development, not the finalized form. But the charade continued for years. In March 2017, Defense Minister Brigadier General Hossein Degan announced the Qaher 313 was ready for flight testing. On April 15, 2017, Iran conducted highly publicized taxi tests with what they called Prototype 08. This version featured some improvements over the original mock-up, including an enlarged cockpit that could actually accommodate a pilot and ejection seat, dual jet exhausts, and a forward-looking infrared turret in the nose. The improvements suggested Iran was attempting to address the most glaring problems with their original design. However, even these modifications couldn't overcome the fundamental flaws. The aircraft still featured the same problematic wing design, inadequate air intakes, and structural limitations that made it unsuitable for actual flight operations. Independent aviation analysts noted that between 2018 and 2022, the Qaher 313 project showed no verifiable progress toward manned flight or production. No evidence emerged of prototype flights, meaningful wind tunnel testing, or successful integration of claimed systems. The final admission of defeat came in February 2023, when the Iran Aviation Industries Organization announced the Qaher 313 would be reworked and fielded as an unmanned drone rather than a manned aircraft. IAIO Managing Director Brigadier General Afshin Kajafard explained that the conversion was necessary to adapt it to the requirements of Iranian military units, though the real reason was obviously the impossibility of making the design work as a manned fighter. The transformation from stealth fighter to drone represented a dramatic scaling down of ambitions. In February 2025, almost 12 years after the original unveiling, Iran finally revealed the JS-313, described as a naval drone based on the F-313 design. The new version came in two variants, one 60% smaller and another 20% the size of the original airframe. The larger variant's flight capability remained questionable, though the smaller version did manage to launch successfully from Iran's converted container ship drone carrier, the Shahid Bahman Bagheri. The irony of the Qaher 313 saga becomes apparent when compared to Iran's actual success with unmanned aerial vehicles. While their stealth fighter was a complete failure, Iran's simple Shahed drones have become globally significant weapons. The Shahed 136, costing just $20,000 per unit, has been extensively used by Russia in Ukraine, proving devastatingly effective against infrastructure targets. These basic kamikaze drones, nicknamed flying mopeds for their distinctive sound, have achieved more strategic impact than Iran's supposed stealth fighter ever could. The contrast highlights a fundamental truth about military technology development. Iran's engineers proved capable of producing effective, practical weapons when they focused on realistic goals and established technology. The Shahed drones succeeded because they represented an evolutionary improvement on existing designs. Rather than a revolutionary leap to technologies, Iran lacked the industrial base to support. The Qaher 313 project consumed resources and prestige while delivering nothing of military value. The fiberglass mock-up may have served domestic propaganda purposes, convincing some Iranian citizens that their country possessed advanced military capabilities. But it also damaged Iran's credibility internationally and revealed the gap between the regime's rhetoric and reality. Meanwhile, Iran's Air Force continued flying the same aging American aircraft from the 1970s. Only in November 2024 did Iran finally receive its first modern fighters, two Sukhoi Su-35 SE jets from Russia, officially handed over during a private ceremony. These represented Iran's first new fighter aircraft acquisition in decades, highlighting just how desperate their Air Force situation had become. The Qaher 313 stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing propaganda over engineering reality. The project's failure wasn't due to lack of ambition or national pride, but rather the fundamental impossibility of the task Iran set for itself. Creating a fifth-generation stealth fighter requires decades of research, massive industrial investment, advanced materials science, and sophisticated manufacturing capabilities that Iran simply didn't possess. The technical evidence against the Qaher 313 was overwhelming from the very beginning. The tire pressures, cockpit dimensions, civilian avionics, aerodynamic impossibilities, and structural limitations all pointed to the same conclusion. This was never intended to be a functional aircraft. Whether Iranian leadership genuinely believed they could make it work or knew it was purely for show remains unclear, but the engineering reality was inescapable. Today, the Qaher 313 serves as a reminder that military power cannot be faked. While propaganda mock-ups might fool some observers initially, the technical requirements of modern warfare are too demanding to be overcome by wishful thinking. Iran's eventual success with drones demonstrates they possess real engineering capabilities when properly focused, making the Qaher 313 failure all the more puzzling. The story of Iran's fiberglass fighter reveals the complex relationship between national prestige, military capability, and technological reality in the modern world. Sometimes the most honest assessment is the simplest one. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. In this case, it was literally made of plastic and borrowed wing designs from a 1950s Soviet fighter.